Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our panelists and participants in locations literally around the world. Today, the sun does not set on the Center for the National Interest. I'm Chip Gregson, and I'll be your moderator. This is the second of a seminar series looking at the US-Japan alliance, asking the question, fit for purpose, the US-Japan alliance at 60. It's a remarkable alliance with much more adaptability than commonly perceived. It began literally under fire in 1950 as the Japanese government permitted 20 Japanese minesweepers to commence minesweeping duties in Wonsan, North Korea in October 1950. Japan, in fact, eventually provided 46 Japanese vessels with 1,200 former Imperial Navy personnel for combat duty under the control of US forces from October through December 1950, a remarkable change from just 5 years earlier. We had the Ron and Yazoo partnership in the 1980s. Japan drove the first wave of Asian economic miracles. We worried about Japan Incorporated when they bought Pebble Beach, among other things. Victory's been called the solvent of alliances, but this alliance responded well to the end of the Cold War. We became partners across many areas of national life, including business, education, research, and politics. Ambassador Mansfield, serving from 1977 to 1988, famously said the US-Japan relationship was the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. So it would seem now as well. Self-examination is always necessary to ensure we are adapting to what we see changing in plain sight. We will do that today. We are privileged to have three superb panel members. Professor Nobukatsu Kanehara served the Japanese government at home and abroad well and faithfully for his professional life, last serving as Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary in the Abe administration. He is now a professor at Toshisha University in Kyoto, and he is an advisor to the Asia Group. Chris Hughes, coming to us today from Great Britain, is a professor of international security and diplomacy at the University of Warwick, where he serves as Vice Chancellor for Education. Daniel Russel is a veteran of the U.S. National Security Council and the State Department, where he served as the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific. He now serves as Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. I will ask our speakers to offer 10 minutes of commentary in the same order as introduced. We will then broaden the conversation to include questions. You may ask questions using the Q&A function through the button on your screen. We will keep this seminar to an hour in respect for everybody's scheduled demands. Kanehara-san, would you please get us started?
Thank you very much, General. Thank you for having me. Let me start then. I want to make 3 points. We have to defend our liberal international order. Second challenge is China. Third is what the strategy of ours. The first one, the liberal international order, it's standing up in Asia. The human dignity is equal regardless of skin color, religion, political creeds, and everybody is born to pursue her own happiness, and the government is an instrument for that. And this thinking is now very much widely shared everywhere. And this is the liberal thinking that we have to defend. And the liberal order is largely the creation or achievement of the precursors of industrialization, handful of nations. The leader was, of course, the United States. We had two big wars and Cold War against Russia, but we overcame it. Now Asians are coming in. We have to think of what they came through. They don't share with us the same history. They were under colonial rule. They were racially discriminated, but they overcame it. Unfortunately, many turned to dictatorship after independence, but around 1990, they came to democracy one by one. The Philippines 86, Korea 87, and Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan, they proudly joined our club. They have great difficulties, Myanmar and Thailand, the Philippines, we know they have flaws. They're very proud democracies today. We have to engage them. We are now at the creation of Asian liberal international order. Second point is the challenge is China. China was with us to face Russians, and we celebrate together the end of the Cold War. And we believe that they would be like us one day. And even after Tiananmen, only Japan stood by China. We received huge criticism from all over the world because we're standing with China, but we believe that we could not push back China to Mao's era. And Deng Xiaoping opened the door to the foreign investments. And we believe that they could be like us one day. Emperor went to the Tiananmen even after the Tiananmen massacre, and we pushed them into the WTO. Unfortunately, Seas China is leaving us, and they are taking the Russian place, and Russia is becoming a junior partner in Asia, and they want to challenge us and carving out their own sphere of influence. I sensed this change in 2008. When Lehman shock attacked us, China saw us sinking in this way, just like Japanese Germans in 1970s after two oil shocks. We were invited to G7 summit, and it was a dazzling experience after the defeat. We believe that we came back, and China saw US down, Japanese down, Europeans down after Lehman shock. They became overconfident. It was too early to think that it is their day, not yet, but they believe that. One, two, the new ideology is patriotism. They created the history because Communist Party can stay in power simply because China was humiliated 150 years. Japanese and Americans and British and French and Germans and Russians kicked them out all, and Chiang Kai-shek kicked out. That's communism. And the communists brought China to their first-rate nation on the globe, the leader of the globe. That's communist leadership. That's a new history created by the communist people. And this is important because the communism is dead as ideology. They needed something. And this is patriotism and a new history version imprinted by national education to the kids. And this imprints some revanchism of history in them. And they are now emotionally driven by that. Hong Kong, for example, that's not freedom. People's will doesn't count for them. It was the islands taken after the Opium War, so take it back. They're simply thinking in that way. Many young Chinese are also emotional these days, and they don't care Hongkongese human rights, and this is what's happening here. They can't think clearly today. And finally, Xi's generation is a bit different from ours. She is the generation of Red Guard. That generation, the 1966 through 1976, the university education was destroyed by Mao for cultural revolution. And Xi's generation is the kids who are the soldiers of Mao. The red handkerchief here, and bogging down the professors, that's them. And they do not understand what the liberal order is. I think Kim Jong-un understands somehow, because he was in Switzerland. And she was briefly in the States, but that generation as a whole do not understand what our world is, why it is important. They don't understand that. Now they believe that they can stand up against us and be strong. And truth is, by 2028, they can be bigger than the United States in terms of economy. It's the reality. It's happening today. So how to face China and engage China? Can we engage China? We can engage China simply because China is today 16% of world GNP. United States 24, Japan 7-6. Sorry, but Europeans 20% less with Brexit. But with Europe, Americans, Japanese, South Koreans, Indians, Australians, we go beyond 50% of world's economic production. And China can never reach the whole of the West. That means we can engage China only when we are united, and we badly need American leadership. Europeans are so busy with Trump, with the Putin. Trump badly hurts the transatlantic relationship. We are okay, Japanese, because Abe-san is very close to Mr. Trump, but we need American leadership to rally the West and the new democracies in Asia. Then we can engage China still. There are several difficult issues here in terms of the military. One is Taiwan. Taiwan is an island as big as Kyushu. 23 million are living there. There are high mountains there, higher than Fuji mountains. It's not easy to take, but it's not impossible to take. And today they would not do that. But when 10 years later, when their economy is as big as the United States, today's budgets, the military, the China is bigger than Japan plus UK plus France plus Germany. It's still 1/4 of the Americans, but they can catch up with Americans quite soon. And in 10 years time, 20 years time, when they believe that they can do this in 2 weeks time, they'll do that. It's just Russians against us during the Cold War. The weakness of the alliance, the American alliance system in Asia is the distance, 10,000 kilometers wide Pacific Ocean. Gunships runs 50 kilometers per hour. They can't bring back the first MEF or Igor from the West Coast. When China believes that they can finish this in 1 week or 2 weeks time, they're going to do that. Then the question is, would we extend, or would you extend the nuclear umbrella to Taiwan? We are covered by American nuclear umbrella. We believe that. We're not like Germans. We believe that, try to believe that. But the weakness is Taiwan. There's no alliance there, no stationing American forces there, no nuclear umbrella there. And if China is induced to fight, it's only Japan-US alliance. Korea would never come. In particular, the leftist government would never come. And Australia is far away, and India is, they are still a non-alignment nation. It's a big nation, but the British, French, Germans are far away too. We can't do that alone, and we can't be engaged overnight. And to think about this seriously is a serious matter. It's coming soon. And second is the maritime expansion, the China. Can I continue 2 more minutes? China's strategy is a very bad strategy. It's brown water navy strategy. It was crafted by Liu Jinhua in 1982. He said that he had to defend the near sea. Near sea is Bohai Bay, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea. This is not near sea. This is the high seas. And usually, big navy wants to have the small territorial water, and they want to occupy. They want to have the freedom of navigation in the 5 oceans. So that's a great navy. China is defending the near sea, the huge near sea, and it's a land army strategy just applies to the sea. It's a very long one, and they are spending huge amount of money and assets there, and they are making big airports, the South China Sea, bullying us over Senkaku Islands, and they are serious about it. We have to change their mind. It's brown water. The weak Navy strategy applies to a vast area. This is a suicide for Chinese Navy. You should not do that. We have to say something to that. The free trade is important. We have to keep free trade. And Japan did CPTPP and Japan EU TPP and US with US TAT agreements. There we have to be cautious about. We are open. China cut us out from their platform, from the network, and they are inside us. They could implant malware. They can absorb a huge amount of data and cyber intelligence and sabotaging contingency. We have to have a zero risk strategy for platforms and for the networks, for semiconductors. We have to do that. And we have to think of supply chain too, pharmaceuticals, rare materials, and semiconductors. And finally, I have to say that again, going back to the first point, we have to hoist high the flag of liberal order in Asia. It's emerging, and history is with us. Time is with us. We have to continue to send this message to the Chinese, maybe at least 20 years from now on. Okay, thank you.
Kanehara-san, thank you for getting us off to a great start. Dr. Hughes, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, General Gregson. Thank you for the invitation to talk today. So we were asked to address a range of questions, and I'll start with the largest and most crucial one and see if I can get on to the others, because it is quite a large question to kick off with. We were asked, is the US-Japan alliance still an effective and stabilizing force in Asia? I think to try and answer this question, we really need to go back to the fundamental purpose, or that grand strategic bargain which was forged between the framers of the US-Japan Security Treaty, which then, of course, developed into an alliance, and see if it's still adaptable to the current strategic environment. I mean, I think for me, there are three basic functions of the US-Japan Security Treaty, which, as I say, has evolved into alliance. And this is a rather crude characterization. but I think it's somewhat akin to the role of NATO, even though of course that's a different region, different context, slightly different security construct. But of course NATO was designed to keep Russians out, Americans in, Germans down, and I think the US-Japan alliance has clearly fulfilled some of those functions as well. So obviously it's to deter adversaries, to maintain the United States presence in the region, and in the past it's had a role in restraining Japan, although of course I think my Japanese colleagues are not going to like me saying that. I mean, in terms of the three roles, the keep out, the deter, well, I mean, obviously during the Cold War, I think it was, the alliance was extremely effective in terms of deterring regional adversaries and providing those security guarantees for Japan. But I think in the post-Cold War period, clearly there are rising concerns, some of which Kanehara Sensei has indicated about the efficacy of the alliance. And I think there's certainly some rising concerns in Japan about abandonment if the alliance doesn't function. We know about North Korea, and it's repeatedly stepping across red lines, and I think that's had a kind of long-term sapping of Japanese confidence in US security guarantees. But again, as Kanehara Sensei has talked about, really it's China's military modernization, access denial strategy, which has challenged US primacy, military primacy in the Asia Pacific, and of course has then begun to impact on Japanese maritime and territorial interests. So I think there are lots of concerns about how the alliance will function, particularly perhaps in grey zone contingencies, and when the United States may intervene, and what point of the ladder escalation will we see US intervention, and therefore what does Japan need to do for itself. But overall, I think some sense that perhaps the US is losing its sense of commitment and implacability in regards to the defense of Japan. In terms of the function to maintain the US presence in the region, of course, this is the primary original function of the US-Japan Security Treaty, to provide bases for US forward deployed forces. And then in turn, as is often said, that is the keystone or the foundation of the broader US security architecture in the region. Of course, even beyond the Asia Pacific, because it functions for the support of US strategic interests in Southeast Asia and through to the Middle East. But again, I think really, really important is that this security architecture is also the foundation of the broader US-led, depends what we want to call it, hegemonic order, US primacy, rules-based order, liberal order, global commons. But for Japan, this is obviously crucial to provide access to economic markets and institutions. In the post-Cold War period, I think the alliance, as General Gregson was saying, has shown tremendous adaptability, I think, around the issue of bases and forward deployments with increases in host nation support, obviously moves to realign US forces in Japan since the mid-2000s to take account of shifting US strategic priorities and domestic opinion in Japan. But I still think there's a kind of nagging feeling in Japan that recent administrations simply have not been able to shift sufficient deployments to the Asia Pacific to keep pace with China's modernization. The Trump administration clearly perhaps has not helped in this regard. I mean, I think there was clearly a lot of support in Japan, and that the alliance relationship has been broadly very well managed by policymakers, but nevertheless a constant sort of talking about the necessity of the alliance, demands for just simply Japan to pay more, I think has sort of sapped Japanese confidence. But again, really the prime thing where I think the Japanese have become worried is that the United States under the Trump administration was perhaps not committed to its own rules-based international order. So clearly, as Kanehara Sensei said, I think Japanese policymakers would like to see some restoration of US leadership in that regard. In terms of restraint, again, I know this is sort of somewhat uncomfortable language to use perhaps in the present context, but I think definitely there has always been an understanding amongst Japan's pragmatists, as we might define them, of the need that the security treaty would actually in some ways function to restrain Japanese military power and would enable those pragmatists to steer a course between what you might call the more extremes of pacifism and Japanese revisionism, and therefore Japan could focus on rebuilding its economic interests. In the Cold War and early post-Cold War period, Clearly, this relationship worked very, very well. Japan, of course, could never again challenge US primacy in the region, but at the same time, Japan could rebuild JSDF capabilities incrementally and within the framework of the alliance. The US and Japan developed a very robust division of labor in terms of military cooperation, the classic spear and shield, and Japan obviously it enabled Japan to reassert its role in the region, to be seen as a responsible international power, to improve diplomatic relations with its neighbors, and to gradually reach out to other US partners and allies in terms of security cooperation. And quite crucially, there was a role in assuring even regional adversaries, including China, that Japan's military intentions remained restrained. More recently, I think there are challenges to this function, and I think perhaps the United States is dealing with a rather different Japan over the last couple of decades. Again, this may be contentious, but I think the Japanese revisionists have been largely restored to power. I think there's a sense that they do not wish to be restrained anymore. There is a desire for enhanced autonomy and agency in the region, and if necessary, a greater appetite for Japan to take more responsibility for its own defense. I think there's a greater willingness to balance adversaries and even to risk some of those attendant security dilemmas. And there's certainly a greater desire for a more equal partnership with the United States, and to have greater influence over US strategy in the region. So US attempts to sort of manage or restrain Japan, clearly I think are something of the past. They only would exacerbate concerns of entrapment and abandonment and risk resentment. So what we need is clearly a much more equal US-Japan strategic partnership. I think I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just quickly alight on some of those other questions. Is Japanese military restraint still necessary and valuable to the United States? Well, as I've indicated, I think we're not talking about restraint anymore. I think we're talking about, if you like, channeling and partnership. Japan will certainly have to do more in its shield functions for the United States, but also I think just the general shield and sword strict division of labor will have to be revisited. I think we will see Japan have some sword functions within the alliance, and we will see Japan having to integrate itself more into the front line of US strategy versus China. But again, this needs to be done very carefully, and I still think there has to be some sort of reassurance function even to China in terms of how the alliance grows. There was a question about where does Japan's regional diplomacy serve US interests, and where does it potentially diverge? I won't go through in detail. I think FOIP is a very positive development for the US-Japan alliance. I think it gives Japan agency and leadership, and it enables Japan to fill in or supplement for those areas where the US finds it harder to lead in recent years. But I think we still may see some strategic divergence over questions like what to do about Russia, South Korea, North Korea still, and potentially even in Southeast Asia, about how to deal with authoritarian regimes. And then finally, what form of US-Japan relationship would best contribute to US regional goals? Well, I think I've kind of indicated this. I think the alliance is fundamentally very strong. It will hold under great stress and pressures, I think. But again, there does need to be constant recalibration of that original strategic bargain. So there will need to be reconfirmation of US guarantees to Japan, but also Japan will have to do more within the alliance, and I think earn greater US recognition. Some of that will be in the military sphere, some of that will be about more consultation around the formation of strategy. And I think some of it will be that the United States has to delegate more to Japan regionally and trust Japan as a key partner, and not become worried about Japan perhaps drifting away. And I also think as mature alliance partners, it means that sometimes Japanese and US interests are not going to perfectly align. I've indicated some of those areas, and somehow the US and Japan are going to have to work through that. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now we turn to my good friend, Danny Russel. Bring us home, Danny. Make it all
My pleasure.
clear.
Thank you, Chip. Those were great presentations, and it's super to be here with you and Kanehara-san. I'll say 60, for some reason, doesn't seem quite as old to me today as it used to. And speaking of anniversaries, we should remember that we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of the response to the 3/11 disaster that spawned Operation Tomodachi, that really demonstrated, in my experience, to the Japanese people that the US-Japan alliance is a two-way street, not something that just disproportionately serves US interests. Look, there are undoubted, those were two really wonderful presentations. There are obviously a lot of straight up military advantages to each side from the alliance. US defense spending is, of course, massive, but it's global. It's dispersed throughout a variety of regions and functions. Not all of those are germane to Japan. Japan's defense budget now is in the world's top 10. It includes a lot of advanced assets like F-35s and ballistic missile defense and so on. So it's hugely beneficial to the United States, above and beyond just the presence of US bases. And Kanehara-san made the point that the importance of the Japanese contribution is multiplied many times by the advantage it provides geographically, which matters. But if we take a step back, my own view is that the United States and Japan have not only a military alliance, but in effect, a political and an economic alliance as well. And if you did an inventory of how many countries there are in the Asia Pacific that are secure liberal democracies with strong institutions committed to the rule of law, that are huge global economies with open markets, that think and act on a global scale and exert influence through multilateral institutions, that are actively engaged diplomatically in and beyond Asia, that have a huge corporate footprint throughout the world, that actively resist hegemonic behavior and coercive attempts to change the environment, that are active in promoting development, health, education, human rights, where there's a strong bipartisan support for the alliance and the relationship with the United States. There's really only one country outside of the United States that has all those attributes, and it's Japan. When I worked for Obama, I used to make the point repeatedly, and it holds even more true today, I think, that from the US perspective, Japan is the most undervalued stock in our portfolio of partners. I think the Japanese, frankly, make it easy for Americans to take them for granted. And the cautionary note here, as Professor Hughes pointed out, is that things are changing and that this exposes us to some real risk. The alliance isn't a canned good, it's perishable, and it's something that we need to keep working on. I mean, it's true that the alliance and Japan's own defense system, its national security system, have undergone, phenomenal upgrades in the past decade. I think the Abe government and Kanehara-san personally deserve immense credit. I'm pretty proud of what you, Chip, and others, including myself, were able to do during the Obama administration. I think that, in 2013, Japan's creation of its National Security Council, passage, adoption of a national security strategy, and so on. Other important changes, new defense guidelines in 2015, and so on, are among the innovations and advances in the alliance that have really positioned us better to now jointly meet new common dangers. It strikes me that these reforms and innovations came sort of on the heels of, dare I call it, the Hatoyama shock, right? In the aftermath of Hatoyama, which presented some real challenges to the alliance. Question now for us is, what kind of reforms and innovations can both sides make on the heels of the Trump shock, which also created some serious concerns and problems. I want to talk a little bit about the free and open Indo-Pacific FOI policy under Abe, which included, in my view, a lot of lateral outreach by Japan to a whole range of partners throughout the region and in Europe, as big as India, as little as Nauru, with diplomatic, economic, developmental, and security dimensions to it. And on the security side in particular, what I found when I was in government was that all of this is additive to the US-Japan alliance and the US-Japan relationship. And Professor Hughes made this point. And whether it was GSOMIA or it was enhanced cooperation on maritime awareness with the Philippines or coastal vessels in Samoa, whatever, it really added to the US effort. So, I defer, of course, to Kanehara Sensei as an author and a practitioner of Japan's FOIP, but my sense is that the outreach really changed in character from 2017 on. Because on the economic side, Japan quickly regrouped after Trump pulled out of TPP. And instead of just holding things in place and waiting for America to come back, which was Abe's original instinct, Japan, working with others, went ahead and created a new arrangement, CPTPP. On the security side, I think that there were a number of factors, but high among them, Trump's unreliability and his contempt for freeloading allies, his romantic attachment to dictators and so on, to me seemed to add a new degree of hedging in Japan's security and strategic cooperation with other middle powers, Australia, India, and so on. And it began to feel less additive and a little more substitutional. Now, I'm not suggesting that there weren't, positive and significant areas of progress made in the defense relationship during the last 4 years. But I think I began to see kind of an America plus one hedging strategy in Japan's relationships with other middle power partners. And to the extent that that was accurate, and that was the case, the mission now is how you turn it around. We're not pulling Japan out of those arrangements any more than we're pulling Japan out of CPTPP. Question is how to build on them. What would an additive strategy look like that integrates the alliance with the enhanced security cooperation that Japan itself has built? One question is whether the Quad can be repurposed for the new era. I mean, the Quad's been around for years. It's built on the idea that closer cooperation among major maritime democracies will serve as a countervailing force, against Chinese assertiveness. But in reality, Quad's growth is stunted. Its footprint is bigger in theory than it is in actuality. Part of it is Indian, resistance. It's non-aligned baggage. Part of it is the lack of follow through on the part of the U.S. administration that talked it up but didn't really do anything concrete. There's no secretariat. There's no structure there, and there's an inadvertent exclusivity to the Quad. So if Korea were to join, would it still be a Quad? If Taiwan were to join, if Indonesia joined, if New Zealand, and conversely, isn't there something wrong with an Asia Pacific democratic cooperative group that doesn't include those nations? But it's not like they're knocking down the door to get into it, right? In part because it's been framed in the last few years as an overtly anti-China coalition. Moreover, it's sparked some anxiety in ASEAN, which sees it through the lens of ASEAN centrality as kind of an interloper. So I'm not suggesting that the Quad is the answer, just raising it as a model because it offers some clues about what I think will be needed to develop and to embed the US-Japan alliance in a broader and better integrated network of strategic cooperation among democracies and among like-minded partners. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Danny. We have a number of questions. Let me repeat for those that didn't catch the instruction the first time around, which, judging by what we're getting, doesn't seem too likely, but you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. Alternatively, you can use chat, but that'll be delayed because it'll go through a relay. We have a number of questions that are deep into security issues, and I'll get to those in a moment, but backing away from security a little bit, but going to the theme of developing allies, friends, and the liberal international order as described by Kanehara-san. I'd like to ask any of the panelists if they have any perspective on what the Japanese Bank of International Cooperation is doing for foreign direct investment throughout Asia and the Pacific, and what the what we used to call OPIC, and now it's the DFC, the America equivalent or counterpart to JBIC, if you will, doing to counter the Belt and Road Initiative and the inroads they're making and the debt finance trap that they're developing. Volunteers to answer the question. Chris,
I'm
any
not a
thoughts?
financial expert, but the Belt and Roads,
Go ahead.
Belt and Roads, and our connectivity initiative a bit different. We don't care that China, makes ports and airports. That if as far as it contributes to the free markets communications, better one. But the China's strategy is a bit different because it's just like Russian pipeline, China center, and one by one. And our connectivity is different, making ports and cuts across the mountains and the Indo-China Peninsula. We want to make matrix type connectivity so that the free market can function and the communications, goods, information, money goes much better and promotes the regional economic integration. There's some difference here, but money is different. China has big money, but our private money is huge. After the Plaza Accord, Japanese yen was $1 360 yen. Now $1 is 100 yen. Japan became very rich. We stopped exporting, but we started to invest a lot. And there's no true government strategy here, but our private money is everywhere, and even in the United States. And we are not overwhelmed by China when we include private investments. We have to come up with the choices. And China goes to the poorest nation, strategically important poor nations, and puts their money in it and take mountains, mines, railways, and airports, and that's what they do. And we have to go there. Very often, our private companies are not interested in these countries, but we should go there with some government assistance and show them the choices. We can't beat Chinese all the time, but we have to do that. In particular, in the Pacific Islands, it's tiny islands. Small money is big money for them. And Chinese strategy is exactly like Japanese Imperial Navy strategy. The Papua New Guinea, Solomon Vanuatu, and Samoa and Fiji. This is exactly what we did. And they are stepping into our naval shoes. And we have to go there and show them that they are with us. We can integrate them in our Western Pacific economy, dealing with drug dealers and customs and the laborers, homelands. We can incorporate fully them. It's not only about money. And we have to show that for these smaller nations, we have to coordinate a bit more to engage them.
Thank you. The National Defense University is well represented in the questions here, and one that I think I would like to throw towards Dr. Hughes first. A perspective on why the EU signed a financial agreement with China with weak consideration for China's past violations of human rights. And extending further, would the United Kingdom have signed on to such an agreement given what is going on in Hong Kong and elsewhere inside China?
So yes, so I'm not an expert on the EU, and you may have noticed that the UK is no longer a member. So I'm not too.
That did in fact make it through the American news cycle. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think on the UK, I don't think we are entirely principled in this area. You remember, of course, the UK was very quick to join AIIB. Straight away during the supposed sort of golden age of sort of UK-China relations, of course, so only about 5 years ago, but of course that's now been, we've now backtracked on that. So we will see whether how the UK will behave in the future. But of course, right now the UK is certainly very worried about Hong Kong, and is clearly wants to play it's reaching out to Japan increasingly as its partner of choice in both security and economics in the Asia Pacific. And of course, the UK would like to join CPTPP. I think there's some talk about the UK would like to join the Quad, I guess, or become the Queen, or yes. In terms of the EU, I can't necessarily comment, but I do think the EU is likewise not always as principled as it makes out, but also just simply, I think there's a slower recognition in the EU because of distance and so on about the nature of the challenge posed by China. And I still think there's a strong belief in the EU that China is a kind of opportunity, and sometimes the sort of the political aspects of this have lagged behind.
Thank you, and let me thank Frank Hoffman at the National Defense University for that question. Let me go now to one that was posed by Dr. Dov Zakheim, one of our board members. How far is Japan willing to go in the context of the Quad, and what does it envision the Quad's role to be in the event of a crisis or a conflict? Kanehara-san, I think this one is aimed at you.
The Quad is necessity. It's not a choice. We are facing China alone here, and Korea will not help us. Taiwan will be a victim, and nobody's here. We need Australians. They are far away, but they are lethal. Very good militarily. Well integrated with the American forces. We need them. And India is not small elephants. They are non-alignments. They would not cooperate with us militarily easily, but they will have a good navy in the future, and they'll be bigger than China one day. So strategic weights would be much, much bigger than China. Their population would be bigger than China soon, and their average age is 10 years younger than Chinese. So that's where we invest. And beyond that, what do we have? The ASEAN nations want to engage Koreans, want to engage Indonesians, want to do that. They don't come to us to help us. They do not want to be involved in big ones fight. The inclination is neutrality. So we have to persuade them one by one. We have to persuade them with values, democracy. We have to persuade them with the economic prosperity. And we should persuade them, if we don't stand together, you could be swallowed one by China. This is your fate. So we have to cooperate. But when we start talking about the military strategic ones, we have to engage one by one. For now, it's only Australia and hopefully India. Malabar is a big thing for them. They are non-alignments. They never do multilateral military exercise, but they invited Japanese and Americans with Australians. They are changing slowly. It's very important. This is not the maximum we want. This is the least we can get now.
Thank you. We have a number of questions on Taiwan that cover a number of issues, including getting down into contingency plan level detail. Let me try and bundle these together in a sequence and start with asking Danny for his perspective on what changes we see coming on US policy involving Taiwan and China. And then I'll follow up Danny's answer with getting into some of the other Taiwan questions that have appeared here.
Well, Chip, setting aside, the crystal ball exercise of predicting the future, I think it is already evident that the Biden approach to China and to Taiwan has a couple of visible elements already. One is that the pure rhetoric and the sort of booming denunciations of China that we heard consistently over the last few years have been dialed down considerably. But second, that there is a continued and perhaps even a sharpened focus on the behavioral issues, the activities on the part of the Chinese that the United States and the West more broadly consider coercive, threatening, and unacceptable. What that likely means is that over time from the Biden administration, we are going to see a lot less of the showy, sort of gaudy actions that really seem to have been part of a strategy to use Taiwan as a bit of a blunt instrument to upset, anger, and backfoot Beijing, and instead focus in more practical ways on what really would contribute to sustaining and enhancing Taiwan's autonomy, preserving the democracy and the way of life that they have engineered, and importantly, perhaps most importantly, actually serving to deter China from both military action, but also from an expansion of the kind of information and influence operations that are active underway to co-opt and subvert Taiwan and the Taiwan system. So that means less of the incredibly expensive, shiny airplanes and so on that are frankly unlikely to be useful and frankly are unlikely to be able to land back on Taiwan after their first sortie in a conflict environment, and much more emphasis on munitions, on very practical asymmetric defense steps that take the prospect of a military operation from difficult to too difficult in the eyes of PLA planners. I think politically as well, there'll be an effort to help restore and to build some international space for Taiwan to contribute and to expand its contributions, both in terms of health and development and climate and so on, but also particularly in economic terms, because sustaining a vibrant economy in Taiwan is crucial to sustaining its democracy and its autonomy.
Thank you very much. A lot of questions go to what we would do if China attacked Taiwan or China invaded Taiwan, and I'm going to forego answering that because that gets us into details that I don't think any of us are expert to talk about, but I would like to refer back to what was mentioned before about sword and shield, which has been the longstanding shorthand to describe the relationship between Japan and the United States, and observe that we are getting further and further integrated. And one of the functions that is driving this integration is, of course, missile defense, because missiles travel at very high speed, and it's not time for a conference to decide what to do. There's got to be some things settled. Also, the congressionally mandated Commission on the United States National Defense Strategy said a lot. It's a very long report, but one of the more interesting things that they said right up front is the United States needs more than just new capabilities. It urgently requires new operational concepts that expand U.S. options. One could, I think, posit that Japan and the U.S. have to work on this together. The United States refers to being our bases in Japan being inside the quote Chinese weapons engagement zone, unquote. Well, of course, all of China, all of Japan is within that engagement zone, which takes away the sanctuary that we enjoyed for a number of years. So things have got to move that way. One thing that relates to that is, I think, something Kanehara-san talked about, and that is the potential of extending our extended deterrence to Taiwan, and whether that is adequate or not. or advised or not? And secondly, what we need to do to help revitalize or reinforce or enhance your term of choice, our conventional deterrents to ensure that, as Danny mentioned, that Taiwan is always considered too hard. Kanehara-san, could you give us a short encapsulation of what you see Taiwan's centrality to Japanese security is?
Our alliance management was focusing on Russia for half a century, and after Cold War is over, shifted to North Korea, and then Obuchi made a new law to help Americans logistically outside Japan, right? And then the 9/11s, and Koizumi sent our warships to the Indian Oceans. He helps the American gunships shooting tomahawks against the Talibans. And this was a big debate because beyond Asia, it's the first time that they engaged forces after the war. And Koizumi succeeded. And Abe-san made a new law and constitutional interpretation. We can fight with the Americans outside Japan. So we're expanding authorities given to the self-defense forces, and the Americans are saying that when I joined the foreign ministry, Americans are saying that you cannot buy satellites. And these days they say, except nukes, you can do anything. They help us. That's the United States, and simply because China is not huge, and Japan-US alliance maybe it's not enough to cope with China, and this is the reality here. Our restraint is not the legal one. This is money. We have only $1 trillion budget. 80% goes to the debt, national debts, or the Medicare and pension, these things, local governments, and 20% are the government's money. And this is the real restraint for us. So we have to cooperate with the United States, but how to detach China over Taiwan? This is a very heavy issue now, very heavy issue. We don't have nuclear British. We don't have nuclear French here. We don't have even Germans, the Turks. It's only us. And if we can engage South Koreans, we are very happy. 600,000 army. It's a great army, but I think they would refuse to fight against Chinese. And Australia is far away. And then we have to think very clearly about how to detach China. Technological wedge is very important, but that's not enough. China is conventionally huge, and Taiwan is so close. Now we have to think about nuclear deterrence, and that would go to some very heightened tension between China and Taiwan and us. But that is the only way to detach China.
Thank you very much. Paul Herr, distinguished fellow at the Center for the National Interest, asked if Tokyo and Washington are having trouble adjusting to a new balance of power in East Asia, specifically the erosion of the sustainability of the United States' historical and central role as a security guarantor. Is the view from Great Britain, Chris, that we are declining as in our role as a security guarantor?
Well, I mean, I can't talk so much about the sort of transatlantic view, but certainly I think the kind of recent very bumpy relations between Europe and the United States under Trump, I think to some extent you could say that's exceptional, but I do think that's generally there's a view in Europe that the United States is as I said in my remarks, there is a worry it's becoming less committed to defense of its allies and probably less able to defend its allies. Now, whether the NATO and other allies have responded appropriately to support the United States is a different question. But I think in terms of the Asia Pacific region, my view would be that certainly Japanese policymakers are worried that, as I said in my remarks, that US primacy is slipping. Partly because of just the sheer, the budgetary effort, the fact that China is becoming more sophisticated. So therefore, I think the Japanese view is that, and it probably relates to one of the questions in the chat, is that the prime Japanese motivation, I think, in impulse is always to try and invest more in the US-Japan alliance as the best alternative available to Japan, and to try and shore it up and buttress it. and do more to support the United States and to fill in and to substitute, to supplement where possible. But I do think still that there is this kind of nagging feeling that even if you do that, then still that may not be enough, and the balance of power primacy is gone, and even the balance of power is starting to turn against the US and Japan. And that this is where my remarks about Japan starts to think about what does it need to do in addition to that on its own initiative. And it probably relates to some of the remarks that Kanehara sensei was making in terms of once you start, do you have to escalate in terms of beyond that, in terms of thinking about a sword for Japan, which is not just merely long-range missiles and cruise missiles, but do you actually have to start to think about your own deterrent in nuclear terms?
Kanehara-san, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, the missile debates, the shield and the spear, the sword, it's a bit too much a caricature. We are saying that 90% Americans spear is fine, but we are not do 10% spear. That's what we are saying. We are not buying B-2 bombers. We don't need that. And the missile debate is a very old-fashioned and stupid debate in Japan. Abe-san is saying, "What do you have on your shoulder? What's this? Think." That's what Abe-san is saying. The SM-3, the shooter of the missile, that's costs the 3 billion yen. 3 billion yen. Tomahawks 200 million yen. Maybe Scud or the North Korean missiles 10 million yen. What are you doing here? That's Abe-san's question. And today, the South Koreans and Taiwanese, they have very good intermediates. The ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, it's only us. And we are doing this. It's platinum bulletproof vest. The Abe-san said, "You are stupid. Think. That's Abe-san's instruction." And we are now thinking. And we have, under Abe's government's time, under Abe's government, we have acquired JASM, that's 1,000-kilometer missile. And Wallace is coming in, it's anti-ship, and it's carried by the F-15. It's a long-range missile. Abe-san says, "Why don't you shoot the enemy?" And on their land. Why don't you do that? That's Abe-san's question. It's stupid, isn't it? And as usual, the leftists and pacifists are making this a political game, and they're doing stupid things. But I'm sure that if people are asked to have a 1,000-kilometer cruise missile shot by F-15, when we're attacked by the, say, Chinese in the Kyushu Islands, wouldn't we shoot back to deter them? The answer must be yes. So this is winning game, but elections are coming soon, so the politicians are a bit timid. That's what's going on here.
It took us 57 minutes to get to the question of missile defense in Japan, which, as we know, is a vexing problem. Many years ago, when Admiral Burda was the chief of naval operations, he made a saying very famous in the Pentagon by arguing that once in a while, the bullet has to cost less than the target. And as Kanehara is showing, we've got exquisite defense systems that cost a lot, and the cost imposition problem is becoming something we have to solve. Last question, I'll pick from Andrew Oros, a longtime friend of the Center for the National Interest. He'd like to hear more from Chris about his view that revisionists in Japan are actually pushing for more defense autonomy.
Yeah, so it's nice to hear from Andrew. So I kind of referred somewhat to what I said before. So I think the prime move of Japanese policymakers, even including those who are looking for a more assertive national defense stance, is to try and do more with the United States, because obviously collectively you can do a lot more. It's going to be a lot cheaper than trying to go it on your own. And so that is a prime vehicle, I think, for building Japanese defense capabilities. At the same time, as I said, there is always this concern that maybe US partnership may fail in some way. There are could it fail over North Korea? Could it fail over Taiwan? Would Japan be left exposed? there is a kind of, there is this sort of potential long-term trajectory of receding US power. So I think Japan, Japanese policy making and security policy has always been about keeping an element of autonomy, building an element of fallback options, and having a degree of building your own capability, which of course you want to integrate into the alliance, but if necessary, you may have to extricate yourself from the alliance. And there is always that autonomous option kind of waiting in the very worst case scenario. So I didn't want to indicate that I think that the prime thrust of what's going on in Japan right now is the sort of neo-autonomists trying to break out of the US-Japan alliance relationship. I think they're trying to break in many ways and actually try to influence the alliance in a way that serves Japanese interests, and they're treated as kind of equal partners and they have more influence over US strategy. But I still think there is a strong strain of policy making, thinking in Japan, which always reserves, always thinking about that option of what will Japan do if the alliance fails. Now, whether Japan could really go it alone is a very, very different question. But I think there are many in Japan that are still watching and seeing what will happen.
With everybody's permission, let me thank our three panelists for excellent presentations and offer the closing remarks opportunity to Daniel Russel.
Well, I'd like to circle back, not to a military point, but to the Belt and Road points that Kanehara-san made about the important role of the private sector, as well as the government. A big part of what JBIC does really is development investment, and it's of immense value intrinsically. The Japanese private sector, as he pointed out, is the largest stakeholder in Southeast Asia, has really helped to promote development and prosperity throughout the region. That's equally important. The United States is badly deficient on both counts. DFC is a minuscule effort with very little direct impact and very little to show. And US corporations, although there's a lot of money invested in East Asia or Southeast Asia, of course, there's a huge amount of investment and commercial activity elsewhere in Northeast Asia, including in China, operate utterly without reference to American strategic objectives, and frankly, even often without reference to American strategic objectives. So I think one area that the alliance, the two countries have to really develop is strengthening the capacity of the governments themselves in the developing countries within Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, to protect themselves, to negotiate with the Chinese, to address BRI, not in the Nike just say no motif. That's never going to work. You can't ask them to forego opportunities for easy money and big projects. But you can educate them, help provide the bandwidth, the support of international expertise, and so on, so that they can negotiate into any deal, any contract under BRI, safeguards for the environment, for debt sustainability, and for the other aspects. And that way, look, if China wants to bankroll the creation of great infrastructure throughout the region, go crazy.
Thank you very much. And with that solid recommendation, we are adjourned.